The silence of the kitchen was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Agnes stood by the stove, her fingers tracing the edge of the counter, waiting for the kettle to whistle. Then, the world shifted. A sound tore through the air, sharp and discordant, as if the very bones of the house were snapping under immense pressure. The roof groaned, a deep, metallic protest that vibrated through the floorboards and up into her feet. It was not the sound of wind or falling timber. It was heavy, dense, and deliberate. The structural beams shrieked in agony. Agnes pulled her hand back from the counter as a fine layer of grit shook loose from the ceiling, dancing in the dim light. The weight above settled, shifting with a grinding screech of metal against shingles that set her teeth on edge. The house shuddered once, twice, and then held its breath, waiting for the next movement from the intruder above. Agnes did not scream. She stood rooted to the center of the kitchen, her eyes locked on the ceiling as the plaster began to spiderweb. A crack, jagged and wide, split the paint, and a fine, choking rain of white dust poured down, coating her hair and the worn wooden floorboards. She coughed, waving a hand through the haze, but her gaze never wavered from the source of the destruction. Above her, the joists groaned again, a rhythmic grinding sound that suggested something was actively tearing through the shingles. She reached out, her fingers finding the handle of a heavy iron skillet resting on the stove. She gripped it until her knuckles turned white. Another section of the ceiling gave way, sending a chunk of lath and plaster crashing onto the table. The table splintered under the impact. Agnes stepped back, her boots crunching on the debris, and raised the skillet. She watched the ceiling pulse with a faint, unnatural blue light. She tightened her grip, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts, and turned her focus toward the trapdoor in the hallway. Agnes moved toward the hallway, her boots dragging slightly against the grit-covered floor. Every step felt heavy, as if the air itself had thickened with the presence of the intruder. She reached the base of the ladder, the wood dry and splintered under her touch. Above, the ceiling continued to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that rattled the very foundation of the hallway. She looked up. The trapdoor was a dark, unmoving rectangle against the ceiling, seemingly oblivious to the chaos occurring just inches away. She reached out, gripping the side rail of the ladder. It was cold, worn smooth by decades of use. She tested the first rung, putting her weight on it. The wood groaned in protest, a sharp, high-pitched creak that seemed to echo through the entire house. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Silence returned, save for the rhythmic, metallic clicking. Agnes pulled herself upward, rung by agonizing rung. The ladder swayed, a fragile bridge between the familiar hallway and the unknown. She reached the final step, her head now level with the ceiling joists. The air here was different, thick and metallic, carrying a sharp, biting scent that stung her nostrils. She pressed her ear against the rough wood of the trapdoor. The rhythmic clicking had ceased, replaced by a low, vibrating hum that traveled through the floorboards and into her fingertips. She shifted her weight, the skillet heavy and solid in her right hand. She reached up with her left, her fingers trembling as they brushed the latch. It was hot to the touch, pulsing with a faint, internal energy. She took a final, steadying breath, her lungs burning with the dry, attic air. With a sudden, forceful shove, she pushed the trapdoor upward. It swung back on rusted hinges, revealing the dark, confined space of the attic. There, wedged firmly between the rafters and the roof, sat a silver craft. It was small, barely 7 feet wide, its surface marred by the impact with the shingles. Agnes gripped the edge of the opening, her knuckles straining against the wood. The craft sat motionless, a dull, pitted silver shape against the dark insulation. Then, the surface began to shift. A seam along the center of the hull dilated, releasing a thin, sharp hiss of escaping gas. A sickly blue light began to bleed from the crack, flickering with a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. It was not a warm glow. It was cold, clinical, and utterly alien. The light expanded, washing over the rafters and turning the dust motes into suspended, glowing sparks. Agnes squinted as the intensity spiked, the blue radiance cutting through the shadows. Every nailhead, Every splinter of wood and every cobweb became starkly defined in the harsh, unnatural illumination. The light pulsed again, deeper this time, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that made her teeth ache. She watched, paralyzed, as the blue energy rippled across the metallic skin. The attic was no longer a storage space. It had become a containment chamber for something that did not belong in this world. The glow intensified, casting long, distorted shadows that danced against the roof beams. And for a heartbeat, the entire space felt as though it were suspended in a void. The hull of the craft groaned, a high-pitched metallic shriek that echoed against the rafters. A section of the silver plating folded inward, creating a jagged aperture. From the darkness within, two small figures emerged. They did not climb, they unfolded. Their limbs were thin, multi-jointed, and tipped with needle-sharp points that bit into the metal hull as they pulled themselves free. Agnes watched, her grip on the skillet tightening until her fingers ached. The figures moved with a terrifying, jerky precision, their bodies twitching in rapid micro-adjustments that defied organic rhythm. They were insect-like, their movements punctuated by sudden, sharp halts and erratic shifts in direction. One figure reached the edge of the craft and dropped to the attic floor with a dry, hollow click. It stood motionless for a heartbeat, its head rotating in a full, unnatural circle, scanning the rafters. The second figure followed, landing a few inches away. They stood in the blue light, their surfaces reflecting the sickly glow with a dull, oily sheen. They did not breathe. They did not hesitate. They simply existed in the space, their limbs twitching in a synchronized, rhythmic pattern that made the air feel heavy. The silence of the attic was shattered by the rhythmic, sharp clicking of metal against wood. Each step the figures took was deliberate, a staccato beat that echoed through the floorboards beneath Agnes's feet. They moved with a synchronized, mechanical gait, their multi-jointed limbs striking the grain of the wood with the precision of clockwork. Agnes watched the gap between them shrink, her eyes locked on the way their bodies jerked forward in sudden, unnatural bursts of motion. The clicking grew louder, a frantic, metallic percussion that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the house. One figure skittered to the left. The second followed, its head tilting at an impossible angle as it tracked her position. They were closing the distance. Agnes shifted her weight, the wooden floor groaning under her boots, but the figures did not pause. They navigated the debris. The clicking intensified, becoming a rapid-fire sequence of impacts. Agnes felt the floorboards tremble as they reached the threshold. The clicking stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The two figures stood at the edge of the trapdoor, their metallic frames silhouetted against the pulsing blue light of the craft. Agnes held her breath, the skillet heavy and cold in her grip. The lead figure tilted its head, a series of internal gears grinding with a low, discordant whine. Slowly, it raised a slender, rod-like appendage toward her. The air in the attic began to change. A sharp, metallic tang of ozone filled the space, stinging the back of Agnes's throat. Tiny sparks of static electricity danced along the edges of the rod, crackling with a high-frequency hum that set her teeth on edge. The figure stood perfectly still, its limb locked in position, the rod glowing with an intense, sickly violet hue that cast long, distorted shadows across the rafters. Agnes watched the light intensify, the hum growing into a piercing whine that seemed to vibrate inside her skull. The reality of the situation solidified in the silence. This was not a search, and it was not an accident. The figure adjusted its stance, the rod tracking her movement with terrifying, fluid accuracy. She felt the skin on her arms prickle as the energy gathered. She tightened her grip on the iron skillet, her knuckles white, bracing for the inevitable strike. The rod surged with a blinding flare of violet light. A bolt of raw energy hissed through the air, moving with such velocity it left a trail of scorched ozone in its wake. Agnes didn't think. She dropped her center of gravity and lunged to the side. The beam slammed into the wall behind her, tearing through the plaster and splintering the aged wood with a violent, concussive boom. The heat from the passing bolt singed the air, a searing wave of warmth that brushed against her cheek like a furnace blast. Dust and pulverized lath exploded outward, raining down on her as she scrambled across the floorboards. The wall behind her glowed, a jagged, blackened crater smoking in the dim light of the attic. Her ears rang from the sudden, sharp crack of the discharge, but the sound of the machine's internal gears grinding back into motion cut through the noise. The first shot had missed, but the intent was clear. The attic, once a place of quiet storage, had become a kill zone. Agnes felt the adrenaline surge through her limbs, sharpening her focus. The terror that had gripped her moments ago vanished, replaced by a cold, singular drive to survive. She planted her feet firmly on the uneven floor, the iron skillet held high, and braced for the next strike. The machine was already recalibrating, its rod glowing once more, but she was no longer waiting to be hunted. Agnes did not wait for the second discharge. She surged forward, her boots thudding against the floorboards as she closed the distance in 2 rapid strides. The lead robot pivoted, its rod beginning to glow with that same lethal violet light, but it was too slow. Agnes shifted her weight, locking her core and swinging the iron skillet in a wide, punishing arc. The metal caught the machine mid-stride, the heavy iron face connecting with the center of its chassis with a sickening, metallic crunch. The force of the blow lifted the robot off its feet. It spun through the air, limbs flailing, before slamming hard into the dark rafters. Wood splintered under the impact, and the machine tumbled deep into the shadows of the eaves, its rhythmic clicking silenced instantly. Agnes did not pause to watch it fall. She kept her momentum, the skillet still gripped tight in her sweating palm, her eyes darting toward the second figure. The first threat was neutralized, but the space was still narrow, and the second machine was already moving to compensate for its partner's failure. She tightened her grip, ready to strike again. The second machine did not retreat. It surged forward, its metallic limbs moving with a frantic, jerky speed that defied its small size. Before Agnes could reset her stance, it lunged, its claws extended and sharp. The machine collided with her, its limbs scraping against her side as it sought a grip. She felt the jagged metal tear through the fabric, the cold, hard pressure of the claws digging into her side. She stumbled back, the floorboards groaning under the sudden shift in weight. The machine was relentless, its internal gears whining as it tried to anchor itself to her. Agnes gritted her teeth, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. She did not panic. She planted her left foot firmly against a floor joist, braced her core, and drove her right boot into the center of the machine. The impact was solid. The machine flew backwards, skidding across the dusty wood before coming to a halt near the base of the attic stairs. It twitched, its limbs vibrating as it struggled to regain its footing. Agnes stood over it, her chest heaving, the skillet still gripped in her hand. The attic was a chaos of splintered wood and swirling dust. She knew the machine would recover in seconds. She needed something heavier, and her eyes locked onto the rusted crowbar. Agnes lunged toward the corner, her boots sliding on the loose attic dust. The machine behind her let out a high, metallic shriek, its limbs clicking rapidly as it scrambled to intercept her path. She ignored the sound, her focus locked entirely on the rusted crowbar lying against the wall. She reached it just as the machine leaped, its sharp claws snapping at the air behind her heels. Her fingers closed around the cold, pitted iron of the tool. She did not turn to face the attacker. Instead, she pivoted on her heel, swinging the heavy bar in a wide, controlled arc toward the center of the silver craft. The iron head of the crowbar struck the navigation console. The impact was absolute. The console buckled inward, the metal frame groaning as it surrendered to the blow. A violent spray of sparks erupted. The machine that had been mid-leap stalled in the air, its movements freezing instantly as the power source died. It fell to the floorboards, a lifeless heap. The silence that followed the blow was short-lived. A sharp, stinging scent flooded the attic, thick and metallic, biting at the back of Agnes's throat. It was the smell of ozone, heavy and unnatural, mingling with the acrid stench of burnt copper. She stepped back, her boots crunching on the debris. The silver hull, previously dormant, began to vibrate with a frantic, uneven rhythm. Then, the sound started. It began as a low, throbbing hum that rattled the very teeth in her skull. Within seconds, it climbed the scale, sharpening into a piercing, high-pitched whine. Agnes pressed her palms against her ears, but the sound was physical, a pressure that pushed against her chest. The ship was dying, but it was not going quietly. The blue light that had pulsed rhythmically now flickered in chaotic, blinding bursts, casting long, jagged shadows against the attic rafters. Every surface in the room began to heat up, the air shimmering with the intensity of the discharge. She watched as a thin, dark smoke began to curl from the center. The whine reached a fever pitch, a sustained, agonizing note. The craft was overloading, and the attic was no longer a place where she could remain. Agnes did not wait for the final collapse. She turned and sprinted toward the trapdoor, her boots hammering against the floorboards. Behind her, the air turned white, a blinding, searing radiance that erased the shadows and scorched the very oxygen from the room. She reached the edge of the opening, her fingers clawing at the wooden frame. She grabbed the edge of the trapdoor, pulling it down with every ounce of her remaining strength. The metal hinges groaned, resisting her, as the light behind her intensified until it felt like a physical weight pressing against her back. She threw her weight into the motion, slamming the door shut just as the attic erupted. A massive, concussive force slammed into the underside of the trapdoor, nearly throwing her backward. The entire house shuddered, the joists screaming under the sudden violent pressure. Dust rained down from the ceiling, choking the air as the floor beneath her feet buckled and groaned. She held the trapdoor down with both hands, her knuckles white, bracing against the rhythmic, thunderous thuds coming from above. The structure of the home groaned, a deep, structural protest as the heat from the blast radiated through the wood. The roar faded into a low, dying rumble that vibrated through the foundation of the house. Agnes remained on the ladder for a long moment, her grip locked tight on the wood until her fingers went numb. She let go, dropping the last few feet to the kitchen floor with a heavy thud. The air was thick with gray dust, swirling in the dim light like snow. She tried to take a step, but her knees buckled, and she slid down the wall until she hit the floorboards. Her breath came in ragged, uneven gasps, each one tasting of ash and scorched paint. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the siding, but inside, the silence was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against her ears, replacing the ringing of the blast. She stared at the ceiling. Her hands lay limp at her sides, still trembling from the exertion, the skin raw and stinging. She did not move. Agnes pushed herself upright, her palms scraping against the grit on the floor. She grabbed the ladder, her movements stiff, and climbed back toward the trapdoor. The wood was warm to the touch, charred in places, and smelled of ozone. She shoved the door aside and pulled herself into the attic. The space was a ruin of splintered rafters and twisted metal. Amidst the blackened shingles and debris, something caught the dim light. A small, circular object, no larger than a coin, lay trapped. Agnes reached out, her fingers brushing the hot metal, and cleared the dust away. The device clicked. A sharp, high-pitched static erupted. Then, a voice broke through the noise. It was thin, distorted. "Central Control, come in. The mission has failed. Gresham is dead. Incredible race of giants here. Too powerful. We cannot hold. Stay away." The message ended with a sudden, rattling cough. Agnes knelt in the wreckage, her eyes fixed on the blinking light. The attic was silent again, save for the sound of her own heartbeat. The silence that followed the voice felt heavier than the explosion. Agnes remained on her knees, the device cooling in her palm. Giants. The word echoed in her mind, stripped of its usual meaning. She looked down at the debris scattered across the floorboards. Her gaze fell upon the twisted remains of the metallic figures she had struck down. She reached out, using the tip of her finger to nudge a shattered limb. It was no larger than a sewing needle, delicate and intricate, now bent beyond repair. The power she had felt suddenly collapsed into a sharp perspective. These were not conquerors. They were scouts, sent from a world so small that her own existence was a landscape of impossible, lethal scale. She picked up a fragment of the hull, turning it over. It was thin, fragile, and utterly inadequate against the blunt force of her kitchen tools. The triumph she had felt moments ago withered. She had not fought a war. She had crushed a desperate, tiny life form that had been terrified of her. The realization settled in her chest, cold and hollow. She had defended her home, yet the cost was a profound, lingering pity for the invaders. Agnes stood slowly, her joints aching from the long time spent kneeling on the rough attic floor. She moved toward the center of the debris field, where the largest piece of the craft lay split open. She crouched down, her breath shallow in the stagnant air. With the edge of a splintered board, she carefully pushed aside a twisted sheet of metal. Beneath it lay the core of the second machine. It was not a weapon of war, but a complex assembly of tiny, interlocking gears and springs, each no larger than a grain of sand. She leaned in, her eyes straining to focus on the craftsmanship. Every component was polished and precise, built with a level of care that suggested a desperate, singular purpose. These were not the tools of a conquering force, but the delicate instruments of explorers. She touched a severed wire, thinner than a human hair. It sparked weakly, then died. The realization hit her with the weight of a physical blow. Agnes sat back on her heels, the silence of the attic now feeling like a tomb for a civilization she had never even known existed. Agnes walked to the porch and pushed the screen door open. It creaked, a thin, sharp sound that vanished into the immense dark. She stepped out, the cool night air biting at her skin. Above, the stars burned with a cold, steady light, indifferent to the small, broken lives she had left on her floor. She looked up, tracing the vast, empty reaches of the sky. There was no judgment in the expanse, only a profound, silent distance. The ledger of the universe had been balanced, not by malice, but by the sheer, unyielding weight of existence. She stood still, watching the horizon where the darkness seemed to swallow the world whole. The price of their intrusion had been paid in full. Stars watched her leave. Shadows embraced her return.